Now we're going to come to our final speaker. Again, more science behind the sin list. And Steffen Foss Hansen, who is from the Danish Technical University, DTU. And he's going to be focusing on the first nanomaterials on the sin list, the carbon nanotubes that we heard about. So what are they? Why did they develop? How did they develop? What are they used for? And most importantly, why did they make it onto the sin list? So Steffen Foss Hansen is going to be giving some of those answers now. Please give him a warm welcome.
So thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation and for ChemSec to hand me this task. So specifically, the task that I was given maybe 6 months ago or so was to evaluate whether carbon nanotubes would fulfill the REACH criteria for substances of very high concern. First of all, we had to kind of identify what kind of carbon nanotubes are we talking about and what are carbon nanotubes. And if you go to the REACH registry, this is the information that you'll find on carbon nanotubes. There's a CAS number, there's many different EC numbers, there's a UPEG name, there's a lot of synonyms, there's some chemical structures mentioned, but this is basically what we're talking about. So what we did is we discussed the criteria of substances of very high concern with ChemSec, and then we started plowing through the literature on carbon nanotubes. Just to list some of the sources that we looked into, obviously we looked into the information that industry has provided as part of the few registrations that have been made of carbon nanotubes. We looked into the published literature on this. We looked at PubMed, Web of Science. We looked at the US EPA Ecotox database. We looked at the OECD Working Party of Manufactured Nanomaterials, their published work. We looked at the IARC monographs, and then finally we reviewed various governmental reports that have been published over the years on carbon nanotubes, for instance, by the Danish EPA, but also by the French ANSYS, etc. Before we go into the details of evaluating carbon nanotubes up against the criteria of substances of very high concern, it's important to realize that there's many different kinds of carbon nanotubes out there. Very often you hear about 3 different kinds of carbon nanotubes depending on how they're curled, so to speak. It's the chirality that kind of determines this. So here we have 3 different. We have armchair, we have zigzag, and we have chiral. And it's basically, if you imagine that you have a sheet of graphite, it depends on how you curl it. You can curl it straight, you can curl it in one direction, or you can curl it in the other direction. And that means a lot for the properties that the carbon nanotubes have. It's also important to realize that you can have different kinds of layers and different number of layers. So we distinguish between single-wall carbon nanotubes, multi-wall carbon nanotubes, and double-wall carbon nanotubes. In this illustration, there's also triple-wall carbon nanotubes. But it makes a lot of difference which kinds of carbon nanotubes and how many walls we actually have. We can also coat the carbon nanotubes, and there's numerous different kinds of coatings, and again, they affect the properties that the carbon nanotubes have in the end. And then finally, we can add different kinds of chemical functionalizations to the carbon nanotubes. So as you probably can imagine, we can easily have thousands and thousands of different kinds of carbon nanotubes by just changing the coatings, the functionalizations, and the length and diameter of these tubes. If we look at what has been registered under REACH, there's 3 different kinds that have been registered so far in different tonnage levels. So there's single-wall carbon nanotubes that have been registered under the 1 to 10 ton per year tonnage trigger. There's tangle multi-wall carbon nanotubes that have been registered between 10 and 100 tons per year. And then finally, we have multi-wall carbon nanotubes or synthetic graphite in a turbulent shape that has been registered in 100 to 1,000 ton. Here you can see the illustration of what a single-wall carbon nanotubes looks like according to the registrant. And here is a picture of the tangled multi-wall carbon nanotubes that the registrant has uploaded to the REACH registry. As you probably all know, there's been a lot of concern raised about not carbon nanotubes, but nanomaterials in general over the past 10, 15 years. This is a snapshot of some of the news that has been put out there. Over the years, carbon nanotubes have repeatedly been mentioned, and repeatedly the analogy to asbestos has been made. Like it's listed up here in the corner where you say, like, in study, researchers found carbon nanotubes may force health risks similar to asbestos. And of course, that has continuously raised the question whether carbon nanotubes should be added to the list of substances of very high concern. And I guess that's also the discussion that you were referring to earlier with whether nanomaterials should be added to the SIN list. So based on our evaluation, this slide pretty much provides our conclusion. And of course, I'm going to go into more detail on the specifics of this. But if we had to break for lunch now, then this is the conclusion. So basically, what we're arguing, or based on our evaluation of the evidence, we think that single-wall carbon nanotubes and multi-wall carbon nanotubes, that they are persistent and that they're reproductive toxicants. When it comes to carcinogenicity, we think that there's convincing evidence that multi-wall carbon nanotubes are carcinogens, and we think the jury is somewhat still out on the single-wall carbon nanotubes. I'm just going to take you through each of these three endpoints in the subsequent slides. So when it comes to persistency, it's well known that carbon nanotubes is probably one of the strongest materials known to man. So it shouldn't actually come as a surprise that they're resistant to biotic degradation. We have seen a few studies that have found minimum or limited mineralization happening in the lab. Under very strange conditions. There was one study where they used horseradish peroxidase to actually show that parts of the nanomaterials actually do break down. And there's also been studies where they used mixed bacterial cultures in very high degrees to also show that there's been some degradation going on. The environmental relevance of these studies is questionable because horseradish peroxidase does not really exist in itself in the environment, and we don't very seldom see temperatures and mixed bacterial cultures like this. So therefore, we think it's safe to conclude that carbon nanotubes as a group are persistent in the environment. When it comes to carcinogenicity, IARC, or the International Agency for Research on Cancer, has actually done a lot of the work for us already. And I'm just going to take you shortly through some of their conclusions. Back in 2014, they actually evaluated carbon nanotubes. They identified, or they didn't find any studies that related to human cancer data, but they did find that some carbon nanotubes were tested in rodents. And one of the studies that they looked specifically into was the studies by Keiki et al. That was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences back in 2011. And what they did was that they looked at a range of different carbon nanotubes, and then they administrated it to rats in different ways. And then they looked at what are the responses, or what happens. And what they found was that the carbon nanotubes caused methyliomas in both male and female rats after different ways of administrating the carbon nanotubes to the rats. They also found that inhalation promoted both adenomas and carcinomas in male rats. So based on specifically this study, they argued that there was sufficient evidence for one kind of carbon nanotubes to be classified as possible carcinogens to humans. And that specific carbon nanotube form was known as Mitsubishi 7. For all other kinds, or for two other kinds of multi-wall carbon nanotubes, they concluded that they weren't, it wasn't possible at this point in time to classify them in regards to whether they were carcinogens or not, and they concluded that there was inadequate evidence when it comes to single-wall carbon nanotubes. However, with that said, they did conclude that there was evidence that both single-walled and multi-walled carbon nanotubes were genotoxic, and they also found that there was evidence of lung inflammation, granuloma formation, fibrosis that was observed both in rats and mice via different kinds of administration, and also that was something that was evidence for both single-walled, double-walled, and multi-walled carbon nanotubes. So since 2014, or since IAC published their opinion, there's been a number of studies that have confirmed the conclusions made by IARC on a range of different carbon nanotubes. I'm just highlighting a few here, but there was one in 2014 by Rington-Hansen, where they looked at 4 different kinds of multi-wall carbon nanotubes, and all of them induced mesothelioma in 40 to 98% of the rats that were tested. There was also a study that came out in 2018 where they looked at 7 different kinds of carbon nanotubes, and they saw that there was a distinction between the form and the extent to which the carbon nanotubes caused methyliomas, depending on the shape and the curvature, so to speak, of the different carbon nanotubes. If we go back to just looking at this, or a lot of this evidence is based on related to multi-wall carbon nanotubes. So you might ask whether this is actually relevant for single-wall carbon nanotubes. And I think there's still a little bit of research to be done related to that specific aspect of whether carbon nanotubes are carcinogens or not. But with that said, it's interesting to note that under Annex 3, under REACH, ECHA has actually listed carbon nanotube single-walled as a suspected carcinogen, referring specifically back to the IARC monograph that I just talked to you about a minute ago. So finally, looking at the reproductive toxicity of carbon nanotubes, we were able to identify a total of 12 studies that are relevant to look at. The reported effects vary very much depending on the way that the carbon nanotubes were administered to the rodents. It's important to realize that none of the studies follow standard guidelines for testing reproductive toxicity, which is partly explained by the fact that it's done by scientists that do not normally like to follow standards that have been developed a long time ago. It's not considered very scientific to follow a standard guideline developed 20 years ago. Some of the studies lack information on pivotal data or simply study information, such as number of sex and animals tested, and et cetera. However, with that said, there's quite convincing evidence that both single-walled and multi-walled carbon nanotubes are reproductive toxicants. I just tried to summarize the studies on this slide. And what you see here on the far left is all the different adverse effects that have been reported. So it might be delay of delivery of first litter, offspring growth, miscarriages, developmental toxicity. And then here you can see what kind of nanomaterials or carbon nanotubes that have been associated with that effect depending on how they were administered. And you can simply see that both the multi-walled and the single-walled carbon nanotubes are represented in this slide. So therefore, we conclude that it's a reproductive toxicant. So summa summarum, I already showed you parts of this slide already. So we think that both single-wall carbon nanotubes and multi-wall carbon nanotubes are persistent carcinogens and reproductive toxicant, except for maybe multi-wall carbon nanotubes where carcinogy still has to be fully established. And that's why we recommended ChemSec to add carbon nanotubes as a group to this SIN list. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you.